Okay, hello everyone. Happy Friday. Um, Before we get going today, brief announcement. I've heard that the other section of A&P got a little behind us at some point in this semester, and so they moved their exam to the last day of class, Friday, May 2nd. And I want to make sure that you all have the same amount of time to study because that seems fair. So we're going to move our exam too. That said, I know some of you take exams in the testing center. If you already scheduled your exam for Wednesday and want to take it then, you can. And if you are in playoff season for a sport and therefore have an excused absence on Friday, contact me and we'll work something out. But I think in general, it sounds like this is a popular change. So that's good news for me too. Awesome. Okay, cool. All right. So let me know if there are problems, but otherwise we're gonna use our time wisely. Okay. All right. So we're going to begin today by walking through an image that you have in this slide deck that isn't fully labeled out with the words you're about to see on the screen. We're going to just be talking through the same stuff that you saw in bullet points in the slides last time. But I find looking at multiple different pictures can sometimes make things a little clearer because I know we had a lot of random words last time. So this is the picture that I'm talking about. You do have this in your slides, right? Yeah, okay, cool. Just making sure. Okay, so I made some annotations in words, but I'm also going to talk us through this again. Okay, so we were talking about, okay, yeah. So last time we were talking about the ovarian cycle. So this is part of the menstrual cycle in females. And we're talking about that growth of follicles, how they grow up until ovulation for about 14 days, and then how they degenerate and become this gland in the second half of the ovarian cycle. So I thought this image nicely kind of labels out all the cells that we kind of have in those bullet points in the other slides. So I'm just going to point them out to you. Okay. So this little one here at the beginning, we're looking at that primordial follicle. So that primordial follicle is the one that's in your ovary starting from birth. So that primordial follicle has those developing oocytes in this phase we call meiotic arrest, because we've kind of started meiosis one, but technically we're paused in prophase of meiosis one if you want to be technical about it. You don't need to know that much, but know that we're paused. We haven't completed meiosis one, but we're prepared for it. We're kind of started. Okay, so we have this oocyte that's growing inside, and we have this little layer of follicle cells around. So that's where we're starting out. And when we're tracking the ovarian cycle, right, this is separate than what's going on in the uterus, but we are going to tack on the uterine cycle later on today. So I'm going to let you know that if you're thinking about physical changes you might observe, this is at the same time as the first day of someone's menstrual period. So this would be at the same time as you see blood and uterine lining shedding out the vagina. Okay, so here's our little follicle cells around that oocyte. Okay, so we're growing. And as we move forward, we're going to have some of those primordial follicles start to develop into primary follicles. Not all of them, but a bunch. Okay, so as this is happening, we're going to see some changes to the layers of cells here. So we still have an oocyte in the middle, and we're not doing anything with meiosis yet. All right, so that oocyte is still this purple bit in the middle. But now around the granulosa cells are these ones in kind of brownish beige. We have additional structures forming. So the granulosa cells are secreting this layer called the zona pellucida. That's kind of separating them, making kind of like a gap between them and the oocyte. And some connective tissue cells around the edge of this primary follicle are developing called theca cells. And I'm just mentioning these because these are also going to be one of our targets of hormones as we start to look at hormone levels. Okay, so we've got more different cell types differentiating here in the primary follicle as we're increasing in size, increasing in maturity. But we're not ready yet. Okay. No, yeah, and then I labeled them, so I mentioned them. Okay. So as we move even further along, if you make it to being a secondary follicle, because all along this pathway, at various points, we're going to have some of these follicles degenerating, going through atresia, so basically dying off when they're not getting enough hormones to stimulate their growth, because we're trying to choose like a winner and a dominant follicle to hit ovulation. Okay, but if you make it to the secondary follicle level, what we're going to see develop is this basically pool you can see here up top in blue. So that's the antrum. So this is like a fluid compartment that you can see kind of in those granulosa cells, in and among them. And this is important because it's going to get real big as we move towards ovulation. And then you can see at the bottom here, that antrum is basically going to explode, which is going to be kind of what propels or at least part of what propels the oocyte when we release it. So this is that antrum, that fluid compartment appearing and then growing in a secondary follicle. Okay. Here, the big picture is what a mature follicle looks like. So not all our primordial follicles are going to make it to becoming a mature follicle, which we formally call a Graafian follicle. But we are going to have usually at least one Graafian follicle, mature follicle develop. The reason it's usually one is that as we start to have a dominant follicle that's responding the most to our hormonal signaling and producing the most hormones of its own, it starts kind of suppressing the ones around it. So this dominant follicle that fully matures looks kind of like this. So we can see that from those granulosa cells that we had in this beigeish brown color, right, we're now labeling out some different stuff. So remaining around the oocyte, we have some of those granulosa cells have become what we call the corona radiata. So like radiating crown is basically what that means. So you can see it looks kind of like a crown around the oocyte there. And here we have like kind of a bridge too. That's also coming from the granulosa cells, technically called the cumulus ophorus, but you don't need to know that. Okay. So those cells are still there. They've differentiated a bit. They've changed their names. They've changed their place. This antrum has gotten really big. You can see how it's almost surrounding that oocyte, except for this little bridge zone. All right. So this is what that mature follicle looks like just before ovulation. Okay. So when we're in this Graafian follicle and we are heading into ovulation, this is when we unpause meiosis. So from birth until whenever this specific menstrual cycle was, so however old you are, but over a decade, right? We've been in meiotic arrest. We've been in this pause phase. We've been stuck in prophase of meiosis 1. Now is when we're going to continue that meiosis in our dominant follicle, in this primary oocyte, in the one that wins, basically. And that is around the same time as ovulation is occurring. So ovulation is when we have that oocyte literally burst out of the ovary, like physically burst out of it. The ovary is actually kind of physically separated from the fallopian tubes, from the uterus. If you haven't paid attention to that in lab, it's worth noticing that, there's some space that oocyte has to travel. Okay, so ovulation is going to occur around day 14. So smack in the middle of our, at least textbook, 28-day menstrual cycle in response to a surge of this luteinizing hormone, LH, that we'll look at in a second. Okay, so that's the first half of the ovarian cycle. So this was all happening during the follicular phase, which is why we were labeling different types of follicles and cells in the follicles. And then we head into the luteal phase, named for the corpus luteum, that little yellow thing you can see in the bottom of the ovary here. Okay, so we expelled the oocyte, and actually it carried the corona radiata along with it during ovulation. So oocyte plus a little bit of other stuff. But we've left many layers of that follicle behind in the ovary, right? So the antrum exploded, but you can see the edge of it is still in the ovary. You can see a bunch of those cells that used to be granulosa cells are still there. You can see cells that used to be thecus cells, they're still there. So there's stuff that didn't exit the ovary during ovulation. And that's what becomes this gland called the corpus luteum. So everything remaining of that follicle turns into this glandular tissue that we see in yellow. That's our corpus luteum. And it's going to take over some of the hormonal roles that the follicles have been playing. And by that, I mean the growing follicles have been producing estrogen. That's one of the ways they've been developing. The corpus luteum, as we convert it into a gland, it's going to produce estrogen. It's also going to produce progesterone, which from the perspective of our ovarian cycle is new. The follicles weren't making progesterone. So that corpus luteum is going to stick around. It sticks around for about 10 days, waiting to see if fertilization of the oocyte happens, waiting to see if implantation happens. If it doesn't, there's no growing embryo, there's no growing fetus. It's like, okay, time to degenerate, time to die off, time to do this all over again. So after about 10 days, it's going to start to degenerate. Its final form is basically a little bit of scar tissue called the corpus albicans here. That's what that last little dot at the end is. Okay. So you don't have to memorize exactly goes what with each of these numbered steps that your book has, partially because it bothers me that those numbered steps are not days, they're just numbers that they've assigned to them. But you should know the general structures that are involved here and the timing of follicular versus luteal and what you should see in each of those. Okay. So that's our review of what's going on in the ovaries. So now we're going to switch and look at the uterus for a second. Okay. So there's also a uterine cycle. We're still thinking about that 28-day menstrual cycle, but now instead of dividing it in half, like we did in the ovary, we're going to divide it into 3 parts. So in your uterus, you're going to have a menstrual phase, you're going to have a proliferative phase, and you're going to have a secretory phase. And they don't exactly map with the ovaries because there are 3 of them, and there are only 2 phases in the ovary. Okay. But those first 2 parts of the uterine cycle, the menstrual phase and the proliferative phase, are pretty much happening during your follicular phase. And the secretory phase is pretty much happening when the luteal phase is. Okay. So the menstrual phase is when you're actively menstruating, so like actively expelling tissue and blood, so actively releasing the uterine lining. So for our textbook numbers, that's about 5 days. There's variation there. Then from the end of that menstruation up until ovulation, so up until the end of that follicular phase, you're going to be in the proliferative phase. So you're going to be basically regrowing tissue. And then after ovulation, as your ovaries are moving into the luteal phase and we have that corpus luteum taking on some hormonal roles, your uterus is going to go into the secretory phase where it starts secreting things. Okay. Well, now we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive here. Okay. So what you're looking at in this picture is kind of a cross section through part of the wall of the uterus. So what we're looking at is the endometrium, so part of that uterine wall. And we're looking at what's happening with blood flow here, a little bit of what's happening with the lining, and we're going to be thinking about what's happening with glands. So these divots, these pits, those are our endometrial glands that we're looking at here. Okay. So in this first part of the menstrual cycle, in the uterus, in this uterine cycling, in the menstrual phase, you're going to be shedding the uterine lining. So you're going to be shedding the innermost parts of the endometrium. We had a lining there. And the reason that's happening is that as the corpus luteum in the ovary is degenerating at the end of your previous cycle, we're going to basically have a withdrawal of hormones. So the estrogens that the corpus luteum has been producing are going to be declining, and the progesterone that it's making as that gland starts to die off are also declining. And without those hormones, we're not going to be supporting the blood flow to all of this uterine lining tissue. So as the blood flow is kind of weakening here, we don't have enough blood flow to keep blood flow going to that lining, so it dies off, basically. And so when it dies off, it's going to fall off. So it's going to slough off, it's going to shed off. And that's what menstrual flow is. So we have the tissue that's coming off the inside of the walls of the uterus, and also some blood, right? Because it's also kind of like ripping away from the wall a little bit. So there can be a little bleeding in addition to the actual lining itself there. So that's physically what's happening here with the menstrual phase. And when we think about the hormones, right? So we're going to be thinking about this as a response to low levels of estrogen and progesterone. They're low because we've just finished degenerating, killing off that corpus luteum. It's turned into this corpus albicans, this little scar tissue point. And that has kicked us into the beginning of our menstrual cycle. So then we move into the proliferative phase after 5-ish days. Okay. So we've shed off our old lining. Now in the ovaries, we're starting to have those follicles developing and growing, and they are starting to produce estrogens again. Okay. So because those follicles are producing estrogens, we now have kind of a signal for our blood flow to start to kind of go back into this tissue a little bit more. So we start to see this endometrial lining regrowing and developing again. In general, the endometrium, this inside layer of the uterus, is going to be growing in thickness. The glands are going to start to get bigger. And we're also going to see a layer of smooth muscle in the uterus thickening. And if you look at the cervix, so the bottom third or so of the uterus is your cervix, it produces mucus generally throughout the menstrual cycle, but the qualities of that cervical mucus change in our different phases. So these glands in the cervix that are secreting mucus are going to be secreting a relatively thinner-ish kind of mucus around this time. But you're going to see noticeable mucus during this time because we have these cervical glands secreting it. Okay. So this is basically because we're starting to have estrogen come back. Okay. And after ovulation, so as we have our oocyte being expelled into the reproductive tract and that ruptured follicle becoming the corpus luteum, your uterus is going to start to prepare for implantation, right? Because after ovulation, maybe that oocyte is going to get fertilized, maybe it's not. If it gets fertilized, maybe it's going to implant on the wall of the uterus, maybe it's not, but we want to be ready if it does. So that's what the secretory phase is for. So we're preparing this endometrium for implantation of a fertilized egg, which means we're going to really be ramping up the blood flow here. So we saw a little bit of that blood flow coming back in the proliferative phase, but now we're going to see those vessels branching and really extending their reach. We can see those glands getting a lot bigger, or a lot deeper here. So we can see them here, those pits for the glands, right? And they're going to start secreting something specific now. So this is why it's called the secretory phase, at least I'm pretty sure. So those glands now are going to be secreting a fluid that's rich in glycogen. If you remember, we've mentioned glycogen before, but in different contexts, right? But glycogen is basically, it's definitely a carbohydrate, but basically it's a bunch of glucose linked together, right? So this is potential fuel. If we have a fertilized egg implant, it's going to need something to fuel its growth. So that's why we have this glycogen-rich fluid coming out of the glands in the secretory phase, because this would be an energy source if we have fertilization occur and we have an embryo start to grow. A signal that you might be able to note if you were paying attention to an actual physical person would be those cervical secretions. So we mentioned that there was like a mucus coming out of those cervical glands during the proliferative phase. Once you're in the secretory phase, it's going to be noticeably like sticky. And the reason for that is that if fertilization happens, that cervical mucus is basically going to form a plug that closes up the bottom of the uterus, right? So the cervix is basically the entry into the uterus from the outside world, or the exit from the uterus into the outside world from the perspective of a fetus or a baby, right? So by having this cervical secretion, the cervical mucus thicken into a plug to kind of close over that hole, that means that we're going to be able to prevent like bacteria and pathogens from coming in through the vagina and getting into the uterus to damage an embryo or something like that. So that would be something that you could potentially notice. Okay. So here this is just kind of mapped in with some of our ovarian stuff. So without a bunch of labels on the ovaries, right? But you can see here that those early primordial follicles and their development, they're starting to grow during menstruation while we have that uterine lining shedding. So you'd actually see blood coming out of the vagina as well as just that lining tissue. This proliferative phase that follows happening up till ovulation as we have those growing follicles supplying estrogen. Right, so they're supplying estrogen, which means we have a signal telling the endometrium to grow its lining back, start to increase its blood flow, start to grow those glands, because those glands are going to start making glycogen-rich fluid after ovulation. They're going to get really big. We're going to have lots of blood flow here mapping up with the luteal phase. Okay. So that's how these things kind of pair together. So overall, when we talk about the menstrual cycle, we're talking about what's going on in both the ovaries and the uterus. And this is how you would line them up. So we have like two sub-cycles that are happening at the same time, not one then the other. Okay. So now we're going to track those hormones in graph form. Okay. So we've mentioned we're thinking about estrogen, we're thinking about progesterone, and we've mentioned a couple of other hormones, which you may or may not remember from our endocrine unit, a couple of anterior pituitary hormones. Okay. So what we're looking at here, paired on to our ovarian cycle is C, our uterine cycle down here is D, right? So you can see follicular phase, luteal phase, menstrual phase, proliferative phase, secretory phase, and our dotted line is ovulation, right? Okay. And up top, we're taking a look at blood plasma levels of estrogen and progesterone. And then here in B, we're looking at the hormonal signals coming from our anterior pituitary, which are LH, luteinizing hormone, and FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, that's orienting us to those graphs. So what we see happening, right, is that during the follicular phase, right, we start out with pretty low levels of estrogen, right? But as those follicles grow, they produce estrogen. So we see estrogen levels rise through the follicular phase. They actually drop off slightly right before ovulation, but then they're going to come back in the luteal phase over here because the corpus luteum takes over production of estrogen during the second half of the menstrual cycle. If we look at progesterone, there are very low levels of progesterone during that follicular phase, right? Because our follicles don't make progesterone. Progesterone specifically is going to come from the corpus luteum. So we can see super low levels of progesterone until you hit ovulation, right? So until you're hitting this dotted line, I'll just start this, right? And so as we turn that ruptured follicle into the corpus luteum, Takes us a little bit of time to fully do that change, but you can see it ramps up its production of progesterone until it starts to die off, right? It sticks around for about 10 days. And it's like, okay, let's repeat this whole cycle over. And so we start to see the progesterone die off as that corpus luteum, that gland, dies off. All right. So those are our two basically female hormones that we are tracking with respect to the menstrual cycle. But we also want to pair those up with our hormones coming from the anterior pituitary. So a reminder, when we were talking about the anterior pituitary, we learned all about tropic hormones, which are hormones that influence the production of other hormones. We saw that most of the hormones coming from the anterior pituitary were tropic hormones, so this is why they're coming back here. And we'll also, in one of our flowcharts in a second, see that they are themselves a response to a hormone coming from the hypothalamus initially. But just looking at what's happening overall, our main thing that we want to remember about both LH, which is the green line, and FSH, which is that lower kind of purple line, is that we're going to see a big spike right before ovulation, right? So we can see that there are some subtle changes in the follicular phase. So that kind of swell that you see in FSH, that's follicle stimulating hormone. It's telling the follicles to develop. So that's part of what's going on with that swell there. But it's really this surge in hormones right before ovulation that is the most important thing to remember, because that's what triggers ovulation, right? This is the cause of ovulation. Otherwise, right, like if ovulation doesn't occur, like this is kind of how you can have like cysts happen. It's not the only way you can have cysts happen in your ovaries, right? But this is necessary so that we actually ovulate the egg. Okay. All right. And we've talked about what's going on in the ovaries and what's going on in the uterus down here. But there is also a relationship between the estrogens and progesterone and that LH and FSH secretion. So we might also notice on here, right, that if we're looking, right, these levels here are kind of staying low, partially because of the presence of some estrogen and progesterone. And that's definitely why they are going low down here in the luteal phase. During the follicular phase, we have to be a little bit careful about exactly when we're talking about, because we actually have a different response to estrogen depending on how far we are through the follicular phase. But in general, estrogens and progesterone inhibit the secretion of these two hormones, which is what keeps it low through most of the follicular phase and what suppresses it after the surge in the luteal phase. So you can see as estrogen and progesterone are coming up, that's LH and FSH going down over here. Okay. So you have these flowcharts. I've just copied in this figure to the side so that we can mark like where we are in time, because all these flowcharts look kind of the same, but it does matter where in the cycle we're thinking about. Okay. So this first flowchart that we're looking through, we're thinking specifically about what's happening in the early to mid follicular phase, right? So we're thinking somewhere like here-ish in time, right? So we'll just pick mid. Okay. So what's going on in terms of our hormones and how they're affecting each other? So we have our first tropic hormone coming from the hypothalamus. So that's our gonadotropin releasing hormone. Remember from our endocrine unit that when we see RH at the end of a hormone, that's usually releasing hormone. That usually is a signal to us that it's one of our hypothalamic hormones, although that's not a rule, okay? But in this case happens to be true. Gonadotropin releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus is making the anterior pituitary produce both FSH, our follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, our luteinizing hormone. Okay. So both FSH and LH are going to be acting on the granulosa cells. The FSH acts on the granulosa cells pretty directly. LH has kind of a stopover. That's why I did point out those theca cells in the developing follicle, that kind of like outer purple layer that we saw partway through. The theca cells are the ones directly responding to LH. What they do is they secrete some androgens and then modify them into some estrogen secretion. So this is kind of indirect effect, but both FSH and LH ultimately are affecting this developing follicle, right? FSH does tell us to continue the follicular development, but at the same time, it's going to tell those granulosa cells to produce inhibin, which creates a negative feedback loop. So at the same time as telling our follicles to grow, we're also kind of turning off this signal for FSH, right? And this is part of why not all the follicles are continuing to grow. So this negative feedback here. Okay. If we're looking at what's going on in the LH, we have more steps, right? First, we're affecting the theca cells, and then they are affecting the granulosa cells, but we're producing estrogen as a result, leading to increasing levels of follicular development. So our follicles are maturing. We have our oocyte and the structures around developing. And we're also going to have spillover. That estrogen is going to end up in the plasma. Okay. And that plasma estrogen actually suppresses both LH, that luteinizing hormone, and our hypothalamic hormone, this GnRH, this gonadotropin releasing hormone. Okay. So the big picture here is very like early and into the middle of the follicular phase, we have these levels of FSH and LH that are ultimately causing our follicles to grow and develop, but we're not seeing super high levels of either LH or FSH because we are also seeing these negative feedback loops suppressing them and kind of keeping their levels low, because our goal really is to just ovulate from one follicle, and jury's kind of out which ovary that follicle is going to come from. Studies go back and forth about whether there's a pattern or not, right? But we really just kind of want to ovulate one oocyte, right? So we want to create development of these follicles, but we don't want to have them all hit maturity. Okay, so we're keeping these levels up, but also not letting them get too high when we're in these early and middle parts of the follicular phase. While we are in the follicular phase, we're going to see the estrogen coming from those follicles having effects kind of throughout the body. So it's affecting the uterus. So it's affecting that growth of the endometrium. It's going to be promoting further follicular development. It's going to be affecting granulosa cells, affecting parts of the uterus. If we look at what estrogen does in pregnancy and in the luteal phase, we can see some effects on secondary sex characteristics too, like tissues in the breasts, things like that. Even effects on kind of like fluid retention in the body more generally. Okay. But when we get to the late follicular phase, if we focus ourselves back on what's happening in this interaction between the ovaries and the brain and these hormones, we're going to see a shift in what estrogen does, right? So in this earlier chart, right, we saw that estrogen was creating negative feedback, right? So plasma estrogen was going to be keeping that LH secretion down and keeping this hypothalamic hormone also down. But fundamentally, once you're in this late follicular phase, estrogen just kind of starts to work totally different with respect to the hypothalamus. So as we're in the late parts of the follicular phase, so we're thinking like here-ish, right? So when we're in these later parts of the follicular phase, okay, we see a shift in what the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary do when they see a bunch of estrogen in your blood plasma coming up and circulating around. Right. So in these later parts of the follicular phase, suddenly we flip from having a negative feedback loop to having a positive feedback loop. So instead of suppressing the secretion of LH and FSH. Now we're ramping it up. Every little bit of estrogen we see is increasing how much gonadotropin releasing hormone we see from the hypothalamus, and it's increasing how much LH and FSH we see coming from the anterior pituitary. So this is why we see this spike, right? So we were suppressing, right? And then we hit the late follicular phase and estrogen starts working differently. And now we have a positive feedback loop. So this is why we see LH spiking. LH is the one we're really focusing on, but FSH is kind of doing the same thing in miniature too. So that's what the LH surge is, that spike. And this is why it's happening. So in the follicular phase, in this first half of our menstrual cycle, in the first half of the ovarian cycle, we didn't really see progesterone because it doesn't really come from follicles. We've got some low amounts maybe sticking around from the parts that you were producing in the previous menstrual cycle, but we're not making a bunch of new progesterone. But as we move into the luteal phase, we have to think about progesterone because the corpus luteum does make progesterone. So in case you're curious about some general actions of progesterone, this is a table from your book. So it's going to create and trigger some of these changes in the uterus that lead you into the secretory phase where we're making big glands that produce glycogen-rich fluid, making a hospitable environment for a potential baby. It's kind of neat. It actually suppresses contraction of the uterus. Progesterone is going to have a role to play in actually the birth process, right? There are hormonal signals when we think about when does labor happen and why. We'll talk about that some other day, not today. But we're also going to see progesterone promoting the growth of glands in the breasts, right? Because we're not trying to have lactation happen during our secretory phase, but we are potentially going to be preparing to ultimately feed a growing baby potentially, right? So the breasts are going to start to swell, start to grow during this part as well. Okay, so in the luteal phase, so after ovulation occurs and we have the development of the corpus luteum, we see some more hormonal kind of flowcharts, right? So we're looking somewhere in the luteal phase. We don't really have to be specific about early luteal phase, late luteal phase here. We're not going to see a hormone that kind of switches how it works like we did with estrogen in the follicular phase. So just somewhere generally in the second half. All right, so we know that we see estrogen picking up, being produced by the corpus luteum. We see progesterone picking up, really coming into existence because the corpus luteum produces it. And we can see that when we look at what's happening with LH and FSH, they spiked right before ovulation, but they're rapidly coming down here during the luteal phase. Okay, so this is how that's working. So we still have some secretion from the hypothalamus of gonadotropin releasing hormone. And we're not going to be specific about how much right now, but we would still have some levels of FSH and LH being secreted, right? So we don't go to absolutely zero. And if we were thinking about early on in the luteal phase, right, we'd have really high levels of FSH and LH here in the early parts of that luteal phase, because we'd be like right after the spike as we go into the luteal phase. Okay, so the luteal phase, it's all about turning that surge off because that surge was our signal to create ovulation, right? So in order to have another surge during your next menstrual cycle, you need to bring it back down. We're not just going to go up and up and up and up forever. Okay, so if we have these high levels of FSH and LH, we'd notice that from the corpus luteum, we're making estrogen, we're making progesterone, and we're producing some more inhibin. So we know that inhibin inhibits, so that's going to be suppressing our FSH secretion. So this is a negative feedback loop. So that inhibin is helping us turn off FSH, right? Estrogen, we know, has different effects depending where we are in the follicular phase. So we're not going to worry too much about what the estrogen is doing in the luteal phase, because progesterone plays a really big role in suppressing our LH and suppressing our gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus during this luteal phase. Okay. So as we start to see the level of progesterone in particular, but also estrogen coming up here in the luteal phase, that's helping us pull LH and FSH down. So we're going back to zero, basically. So that's what happens in an individual cycle. So an individual 28-day cycle. We have this movement from growing follicles in the follicular phase in the ovary, paired with first shedding the old lining of the uterus and then starting to grow a new one. Then after ovulation, we start to produce this corpus luteum. That's a gland that makes estrogen, makes progesterone, and our uterus is in the secretory phase, waiting to see if fertilization and implantation happens. We're producing this kind of hospitable environment for a potential growing baby. If we don't have fertilization and that doesn't happen, all these tissues die off and we repeat over again. But that's not the only kind of timing thing we want to think about when we think about reproductive function. There's also long-term kind of effects of hormones on the reproductive system in females. Okay. So in both males and females, we have puberty happen. So we mentioned it before when we were thinking about the male reproductive system. Here we can see what's going on in females. So in females in puberty, a lot of what's happening is a response to estrogen. So during puberty, you start to see this ovarian cycle happen, triggering this menstrual cycling that we see on a monthly basis for decades thereafter. And so as we're producing estrogen coming from the ovaries, coming from these follicles, we're going to see secondary sex characteristics appear. And the timing of that isn't exact. Some of these are going to be appearing in response to some levels of estrogen before a menstrual period actually ever first appears, but it's an estrogen response pretty basically. So we're going to see in females, we're going to start to see widening of the hips happen at puberty. You're going to start to see growing fat deposits in the breasts, in the hips, in the butt. So we're going to be kind of changing the shape of the body, changing weight distribution. You're going to see changes to the skin, production of oil, changes to body hair, so production of like pubic hair. You're going to see changes to the growth of bones during puberty. And then during the reproductive years, so while menstrual cycling is actually happening, these levels of estrogen that we have coming from growing follicles and then coming from the corpus luteum in the second half of the ovarian cycle, we're going to have estrogen levels relatively high because one of those two things is usually happening on any given day. So these secondary sex characteristics are maintained by those kind of highish levels of estrogen. Okay. However, unlike in males, we do have basically the loss of fertility in females, right? Because we started the beginning of meiosis. We set up for meiosis in utero, in the growing fetus before birth. So we had the maximum number of egg cells that we were ever going to have when you were born, which also means that we've kind of set up a situation where estrogen levels are going to decrease because at some point we're going to run out of follicles that produce estrogen. They're going to get less effective at producing estrogen. And in general, we're going to have fewer of them and fewer of them. And so we're not going to have quite so many of them competing to be the dominant follicle in any given menstrual period. So when we hit menopause, this is when we're going to see the end of this cycling. We're going to see women noticing that they don't have a period anymore because we don't have this ovarian cycling happening anymore, which means we don't have these same hormonal cycles happening anymore, which means we don't have reproductive function happening anymore because we don't have ovulation anymore, right? So lots of things are ending basically. Okay. But because all those things are ending, because the ovaries were really what was producing a bunch of estrogen, this means that in menopause, our estrogen levels are going to be way lower. So estrogen levels are going to drop off during menopause. And estrogen was keeping some of those secondary sex characteristics like tissue in the breasts, like some of this bone growth stuff, keeping those things happening. So you're going to see some changes to body shape in menopause because of these lowered levels of estrogen, not maintaining those tissues anymore. We're going to see some weird temperature regulation stuff happening. So hot flashes or brief flashes of literally feeling super hot. This is also kind of a reaction to these changes in hormones, this kind of loss of estrogen and this loss of hormonal cycling as this is kind of decreasing. And because of these changes to hormonal levels throughout the body, we're also going to see disease risks changing. So in menopause, women are going to become more prone to heart disease and more prone to osteoporosis because part of what was protecting them from these conditions earlier in their lifespan was the presence of these hormones and some of this hormonal cycling. So we are going to pause there because that's going to bring us into our next section, talking about fertilization and how and why that happens and what happens if it does. So we'll talk about that on Monday.